Today is the discussion in the OSHA webinar series for Conn Maciel Carey on construction standards. Today we're going to have a quick kickoff on from Rachel Conn on Cal OSHA construction enforcement and some of the important elements out there that you need to be focused on. And then we're going to dive into some specific standards and the statistics and best practices we see involving them from the federal side as well, and the state plans. So whether that's excavation and trenching or fall protection or scaffolding or the use of personal protective equipment. As we move through that today, you'll hear from a set of us, but my name is Nick Scala. I'm a chair of the National MSHA practice group over here and a partner in the OSHA practice group as well. Spend my time representing companies all around the country in OSHA and MSHA matters, and a great deal of that time is spent with companies in construction and the construction kind of adjacent fields, where mining and construction often have some repeat customers between the two in terms of what work you are conducting. I will let my colleagues introduce themselves, starting with Rachel.
I'm Rachel Conn, and I'm a partner and the chair of the California practice here at Conn Maciel Carey, based out of the San Francisco office. And before joining Conn Maciel Carey, I was the chair of Nixon Peabody's OSHA practice, and gonna present today just a little bit on what's going on with Cal OSHA. Cal OSHA keeps me quite busy out here in California on everything from litigation, compliance, rulemaking, and we'll go through what's the latest from the California side.
Thanks, Rachel. My name is Tony Castelletta. I'm senior counsel with Conn Maciel Carey. I am out of the Detroit, Michigan office. I've been with Conn Maciel for a few years now, but before becoming an attorney in my previous life, I was an OSHA compliance officer with Michigan OSHA for 18 years. 3 of those years were spent in general industry, while the remainder of my career was spent in the construction industry doing compliance investigations in the Detroit area. I was also in charge of the Michigan OSHA asbestos program and ultimately a supervisor manager for my OSHA's construction safety and health division, overseeing all the industrial hygienists for the state of Michigan. I have a unique background in that I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in industrial hygiene, but I have spent a good amount of time doing, like I said, construction investigations. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about fall protection today, and I'm looking forward to the presentation. I'll pass this on to my colleague, Mark Ishu.
Thanks, Tony. It's I think we have a great presentation for you guys today. My name is Mark Ishu. I've been at Conn Maciel for about 2.5 years as a senior counsel. I'm based out of the Chicago office. Before I joined the firm, I was a solicitor at the U.S. Department of Labor, where I represented OSHA in all types of matters, including construction cases. I did quite a bit of litigation for them, but I also helped them put together their investigations. I taught compliance officers how to maintain kind of the legal side of their investigations. So I'm very, very versed in what you're going to be dealing with, or what you will deal with if you ever, have to deal with OSHA in the first place. So I'm going to try to give you that unique perspective today in the presentation on scaffolding as well as PPE. And so next, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Thanks, Mark. So we're going to kick off with the top Cal OSHA violations for construction. And the reason why we're doing that is because if you have facilities in California, if you have work in California, you know that it's the most aggressive state. It continues to be more aggressive. And one of the things that I also want to highlight about what's going on with Cal OSHA throughout any industry is that they have ramped up their Bureau of Investigation unit and have filled out to over 10 positions there. So the Bureau of Investigation is the arm of Cal OSHA that looks into whether there's been criminal conduct as part of a fatality or serious injury. So we are seeing that become more and more aggressive. So it's even more of an important time if you have sites and projects in California to make sure that you are looking at these top violations. So I'll start off just quickly with the latest data. Well, not the latest. This is from April of 2025, but the latest that's been provided by Cal OSHA, which breaks down the inspections by industry. And as you can see here, in construction has the highest number of inspections out of any of the top high hazard industries. So we know that construction is going to continue to be a priority for Cal OSHA. And not only are they building out BOI, but they've been trying to build out more and more COSHOs, the legal department. So we know that construction will continue to be an emphasis area. And to the extent that you are curious, on the side, it has a breakdown of the different types of inspections and the triggers for those inspections. But certainly construction has the highest level of inspections in California. So by far, the number one violation in construction in California is the Injury and Illness Prevention Program. If you have projects or facilities in California, this will be no surprise to you. The IIPP is similar to what you consider at the federal level, the General Duty Clause, although it has 7 different components, elements to it that you have to abide by. But it is a catch-all, and it's not limited to just serious injuries or illnesses. On the construction, for the construction standard, not only do you have to comply with the general industry standard, but there's several other elements that you have to comply with as well, in addition to that. So that's going to include your code of safe practices, which they include the language that should go into that. I will say I see employers get citations all the time about not revising those to be specific to their work site. So make sure that that is something that you're looking at and doing, and just not copy and pasting your code of safe practices. They have to be posted or be provided to each supervisory employee so they can have it readily available. That's a citation we also see often, and that's low-hanging fruit. And one of the reasons why it's really important to go through these top violations is because these are the ones that are really ripe for repeat citations. And so, that one in particular, easy repeat. And in California, we know that those, they just rack up very easily. So you're also going to have your periodic meetings of supervisory employees, and supervisory employees shall conduct your tool talks and tailgates as well. So just make sure that you have those code of safe practices and your IIPP up to date. Don't have any low-hanging fruit there for Cal OSHA. And outdoor heat illness prevention, again, a top one for construction. And one of the things, and one of the reasons why I wanted to add these slides in for this presentation, is because the IIPP and outdoor heat illness prevention are unique Cal OSHA standards that you need to be aware of, that are going to be different than your work sites at the federal level. I won't go through all of the elements of this, but just know that this continues to be an emphasis area for Cal OSHA. They have their special emphasis program. If they receive a complaint, they will not do an investigation by letter. They will come on site. So make sure that you're reviewing that program, especially now that there's indoor heat illness as well. That regulation came out last summer. So make sure that if you have your indoor folks, that's compliant with that regulation, training's up to date, documentation, and ensure that water is available and in the right quantities. And then reporting citations, one of the top 3 for the construction industry as well. And this is the number one repeat citation that we see. And Cal OSHA is very, very strict with reporting citations. It's very difficult to get those removed or withdrawn once they've been issued, and they have very high standards for what's considered due diligence to determine whether or not somebody has been admitted. So certainly make sure that your supervisors and managers, once they learn of an injury that may be serious, that they're reporting that to the right people, so you can make a determination as to whether that needs to be reported to Cal OSHA. And then just lastly, I'll say some top predictions for 2025, 2026. So that data was based on 2024. We'll continue to see IIPP and HIP dominate the citations, dominate top violations. So make sure that you have those documents, those programs, training, records that are required under both IIPP and heat illness in good shape. And some potentials for 2026, probably indoor heat. We've had revisions to lead and silica, and we're seeing a rise in workplace violence prevention, citations, inspections, and enforcement. And so if you do not have those programs in place, training in place, make sure that you've done it. It's been about a year since that went into place. And then there is the annual retraining on that. So make sure that you are doing that as well. And with that, I will send it back over to Nick.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Appreciate that overview on what's happening in California. You're always keeping us up to date with that, and it's clearly a consistent moving target for you. We're going to kind of segue now into kind of the specific standards that we see most frequently cited on the federal level and in many of the state plans as well when it comes to construction. And one of those that we see consistently cited, and that also has some of the most serious citations, the most repeat citations, the most potential for willful citations based off of the continued work practices, is that related to excavation and trenching. So we'll take some time now and dive into what are the most cited elements of the excavation and trenching standards and some of the aspects that we can learn and take from there. So kind of moving forward, first off, confirm what is classified and regulated under this section. So subpart 19, or I'm sorry, subpart P of 1926 is the part that governs excavations. That includes trenches. So according to OSHA's definition, an excavation is any man-made cut, cavity, or trench or depression in the earth's surface, and a trench is defined as a narrow excavation. So when we hear this standard specifically are going to talk very much on the excavation side. That is what they're going to have in the title, but it applies to trenching, as trenching is part of excavations. This is an active area. OSHA has a guidance document that for employers to kind of review some of those aspects to it. I've cited that there. It's that OSHA 22610R. It is from 2015. That is a useful resource if you're looking to kind of get a basic understanding of the field and what the expectations are and what some of the minimum requirements are when dealing this from OSHA's perspective. Additionally, this gets a great deal of attention because there's a national emphasis program in place, and that has been effective since 2018 in this rendition and continues to be. It is throughout the federal jurisdiction states, and the state plan states, as they are required to do, must have either adopted that standard or adopted a system of regulation and regulations that are more protective than that at the federal side. So this is an area around the country that we see consistent focus and pressure from the regulators. And that comes, as we typically see, because it's an area where OSHA typically tracks a higher number of serious injuries or fatal injuries that are related to the work. And some of those areas that we see them consistently cite and issue enforcement are up there on the screen now. So these are about the 5 standards that we see cited most often with trenching and excavations. From the most cited, which would be protective systems. And we'll talk about each of these topics a bit more, to means of egress, protection from materials which could fall in to the trench or on the workers that are in the excavation, to daily inspections, and then excavations and how they work when you're having the interplay of water, whether that's water that's accumulated through rainstorms and the conditions that it might have changed on the actual excavation itself, or perhaps you are in a situation where you're trying to pump water out of your area so they complete work, or there's just runoff that finds its way there. There are specific steps that we need to take there, and oftentimes are areas for some enforcement. This subpart was fairly active, and in 2023 it was cited over 1,400 times. Many of those citations were repeat, more than 100, more than 40 of them were willful violations. The vast majority was serious rather than others than serious. So it is an area that when OSHA does issue enforcement, they issue more serious enforcement than, you know, something having to do with another than serious violation, right? They consider this to be a serious hazard and issue paper accordingly. Additionally, just the one standard, 1926 651, so with respect to excavations, was cited more than 600 times in 2024, with more than $4.2 million in penalties to the construction industry. And that's really just to give you, you know, some kind of fixed point where you can tell that this is something that the agency does enforce pretty seriously with. And so if you are going to be subject to working in these conditions, if you are a contractor, a company that engages in trenching or excavating frequently, you know, you do need to pay attention to these, not only because it's in the best interest of you and your workforce to work safely and to meet the minimum requirements to comply with the OSHA regulations, but also because if you're not, you can face some pretty serious fines and pretty serious allegations in terms of what that written enforcement looks like. And, you know, as we mentioned before, this is part of a national emphasis program. And it is one of the, you know, one of the many emphasis programs that focuses a good deal on what can be seen in plain view, right? A lot of this, when we're dealing with construction, the compliance officers simply see it when they're driving through town. And in those instances, they're driving by a construction site, they might see trenching activities. And, you know, under that NEP, they are likely to stop by, review the practices, see if there's any compliance issues or if there's any safety issues. So, you know, these are also those instances where we often see, you know, a bit more surprise visits. And if we aren't monitoring our situation, our crews and our teams to make sure they're doing things compliantly, often with excavation or trenching, the compliance officer sits to the side, watches what's going on, takes photos and or videos of what they believe to be the non-compliant activities or conditions. And by the time they introduce themselves, because things are in plain view, a lot of times when we're in construction sites, they already have most of their case put together. So it's important that we, you know, are aware of these requirements. We train to them. We hold our team accountable to them. One, to make sure that our team is working safely, but also because they're unique in that they often can be seen just by people driving by on the side of the road. If you're doing road construction or installing trenching or doing other types of construction projects and excavating, you know, near public throughways or public areas where maybe there's additional development going on, and that can lead to just the happenstance of OSHA viewing what you're doing and what's taking place. So let's dive into each one of these standards a bit more as we push forward. But the first one I want to talk about is 1926 52A1. And as I mentioned, that is for the standard that requires protective systems to be put in place. And what that says is that each employee in an excavation shall be protected by cave-ins by an adequate protective system, except when excavations are made entirely of stable rock or are less than 5 feet, and there's an examination by a competent person provides no indication of a potential cave-in, and the system shall have the ability to resist failure of all loads intended or could reasonably be inspected to be applied or transmitted to the system. So, you know, some clear guidance right there from what is meant to be protected by with this requirement. And what we're really saying here is, you have to have a system in place. You have to analyze and evaluate the soil, the conditions around it, to determine if you need to slope or bench the sides of your excavation, if you need to add additional support to the sides of them, or if you need to go the avenue of using something such as a trench box that is designed to be lowered into the area and positioned between the side walls and where individuals are working, so that they will not be harmed in the event that the sides collapse. Now, what should we be doing? To determine what is the appropriate protective system. That comes back quite a bit to our pre-planning, right? Looking at what are the conditions around where we're going to work, right? Is there going to be weather concerns? Have we evaluated the soil condition to decide if it's going to be stable rock or if it's going to be loose unconsolidated material? And at that point, we're looking at if we have, type A, type B, or type C soil, which type A being, the most stable outside of what we call stable rock, and type C being the loosest and least stable. And depending on what you have there, that analysis and that evaluation will drive what protective measures you need to include. But there's other items that we want to consider there. So we've talked about whether you're going to have proximity to other work environments, such as physical traffic or additional structures nearby, or if you have water that is going to be a constant or intermittent concern, whether that's by runoff or by the water table and digging down and excavating into that. So, you want to take these considerations into place, obviously have a competent person doing them, but when you're deciding on that system, those have to be considerations that we are looking at and evaluating. And we'll talk about later in this little section what is an idea of a competent person, but those evaluations need to be done by a competent person as well in this particular area to help design and implement what is the appropriate protections for individuals in a trencher excavation. The next section is that we have to have a means of egress in place at all times in order for employees to exit the excavation or trench. That can be either a stairway, a ladder, which is likely most common, or a ramp or other safe means of egress. Anytime that we're below 4 feet, right? Anytime that we're doing an excavation that's 4 feet in depth or more, and you cannot have that means of egress more than 25 feet from where employees are working or standing. There has been some interpretation on this and some letters interpretation that OSHA has put out there. I think the most recent one, and one that I think is helpful for us to review, is a question of where someone is asking, in this case, the scenario they're laying out is they're working in an excavation. There are tight quarters. There's not a great deal of room to have a ladder in place at all times while individuals are working and performing the tasks that they're assigned to do. And so the employer or the individual asked if they could remove the ladder if they had people on standby to place a ladder, if they had training and a program in place in order to ensure that people knew to place the ladder immediately and recognize certain conditions and hazards. And OSHA's response was just simply no, right? They said that your means of egress isn't limited to a ladder, right? There are other options there, stairway, ramp, or other means. But in OSHA's opinion, they stated that they are unaware of safety problems that would be caused by the presence of a ladder that would pose a greater hazard than its absence. So, that's at least good to see in terms of OSHA's expectation that there will always be a means of egress. And that's really something that's easy for us to, repeat, and easy for our individuals, our employees to commonly forget, especially if they're moving something around. Maybe they throw the ladder up on the side. They really should not be doing that. You have to make sure that at all times there is a means of egress in there. This is also one that is going to be an easy citation, easy standard to repeat, especially if we don't have kind of tight grips and type inspections and type policies on our team, because it's removing a a ladder could easily be done. And obviously ladders are, very much their own issue. Ladders are one of the most cited standards in construction as well. We're not going to be touching on that one today, but things to consider there are just, do you have the ladder? Is it extending as far above the lip as it needs to be for a particular area? Are individuals using it properly, or does it have damage? You got to make sure that they are in good condition. Are people having to using the top step of the ladder in order to exit the excavation or access any other area on the site? So these are, kind of areas where a couple of standards can work together, and you can have this interplay between them. But one of the big things is, though, just you always have to have a means of egress there. And that's a very easy one, with ladders being a common method there, that people might just lay them to the side, and it might have been for 5 minutes, or it could have been for an hour. But you have to make sure that they keep them in place, because each time it's out of place, that can be a violation. And those are easy ones, like I said, to repeat and kind of stack there. And if you start building up a record of having repeat violations on not having a means of egress there, then we're eventually going to be looking at willful. And I think that, those are certainly situations that anyone would want to avoid. The next standards we'll take a look at quickly here are the protection from materials. So there is a standard 1926 651J2, and that says that we have to protect the people that are working in the excavated area from items, equipment, material, the excavated dirt that has been removed from the area, from falling back or rolling back into the excavation and harming them. One of the areas here that we see is that it says materials or equipment have to be kept at least 2 feet from the edge of the excavation, or by use of retaining devices that are sufficient to prevent the materials from falling in or rolling in to the excavation. So, this is one that is often cited by OSHA, because people just have equipment that is laying too close to the edge, or when they were digging up the material, they set the pile too close to the edge, or have even the mobile equipment working too close to that edge. Oftentimes, what we see, though, is OSHA see things close to the edge, but they might not collect those measurements. So make sure when you're working with, if you are going through an investigation or an inspection with OSHA, and they're making allegations that things are too close to the edge, you don't necessarily have to do the measurement for them if they don't collect their own measurement. But I would certainly want you to go back and verify how far an item was from the edge, because again, if they are not taking that measurement themselves, often we see, it's going to be in our benefit to know exactly how far it was, because, someone eyeballing how far something is, that is not going to stand if we actually have a measurement that proves to the contrary. So keep that in mind. Yeah.
Hey,
Tony.
Nick, I just wanted to kind of chime in on this. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And we see that quite often on these types of investigations where OSHA is out for the purposes of addressing an excavation issue. A lot of times they're going to come out and there's just kind of eyeball things, and just be aware of that, kind of take note of it. Understand what they're looking at, but don't take your tape measure out and do the measurements for them. That's key, what Nick is saying. Let them do the work. Don't do the work for them. In the event that we represent a client that's dealing with these types of investigations, OSHA is going to base their citations off of their measurements. We don't want to do the measuring for them. So if OSHA does not have the measurements and they're saying it's within 2 feet, but then we can come back and show that after OSHA left, we didn't change anything at the site, but we took measurements. Here's photos. Here's the details of exactly how far it is. And we can show that it was within compliance. OSHA doesn't have anything to rebut that. So a good pro tip from Nick is to, keep an eye, understand the investigation, but just don't give anything, don't do OSHA's investigation work for them.
Yeah. And it might sound far-fetched, and, that this would happen, it might seem pretty straightforward that if there's a regulation based off a specific distance, that OSHA would collect that information. But, it as Tony said, it is not that uncommon. And Tony and I have a case on our desks right now that we're working together on that has this exact issue at play. So something to keep in mind if you are undergoing some inspection there. The next standard is the accumulated water. So it says that employees shall not work in excavations where there's accumulated water or where it is accumulated unless there have been adequate protections put in place. This is one that we have to keep an eye on, right? It is going to include and really play into our next one about the daily inspections by a competent person. But we have to understand that if there is going to be water as an issue in an excavation, which often is usually the case, we have to consider what are we doing to remove that water? Are we ensuring that we are mitigating that? Has it affected the stability of the sides of our excavation in any way? And take all those into consideration with determining, do we need to change our protective measures that we have in place? Do we have to change our approach in order to reduce this water build up? And if we are removing water using a pump or other kind of equipment, we have to make sure that that is going to be monitored by a competent person throughout work to ensure that it is going to be operating properly. And that, as I mentioned before, with a competent person, that flows nicely into the final standard, and honestly one of the most important ones that we can look at, and that is the required daily inspections by a competent person. So 1926 651 K1. It says that there has to be daily inspections of excavations, the adjacent areas, the protective systems. This has to be done by a competent person. It has to be done prior to the start of work and as needed throughout the shift. It has to be done after every rainstorm or other hazard increasing occurrence, which is obviously a vague description, but if there is some kind of damage to the sides of the trench or the excavation or any other damage to a piece of the protective measures or trench box, then we'll have to conduct an additional inspection there. It is important to note, though, if you have areas that are not being accessed by the employees and exposure is not reasonably anticipated, we don't have to conduct an inspection on that specific area. And what's important there is that you clearly document what areas are going to be worked in on a daily basis and what areas will not be worked in with as much specificity as you can possibly do, especially if we have kind of a large work site where maybe there's an extended area of excavations or trenches and we're working in a single part of it for that shift, and maybe there's 2 or 3 other sections that we're not working. If you are not going to be completing inspections in all those areas because where people won't work that shift, then you need to try and document that those areas were not active, just so there are not questions about why they weren't inspected when and if that is called into question. If a kind of building on that, the next part of that standard in K2 says when the competent person finds evidence that a situation could result in a cave-in or indication of failures, hazardous atmospheres, or conditions, the employee shall be removed from the area until the necessary precautions have been taken to ensure their safety. So there's an inspection and identification element, and then an immediate removal until protective measures are put in place. And here OSHA thinks of a competent person as one that's designated by the employer, is capable of identifying the existing hazards and or predictable hazards in that area, and is authorized to take prompt action to correct measures or eliminate them. And that's an important aspect there. If someone is doing the inspection, they have to be able to direct the workforce to either remove them from it or take additional steps to remediate the conditions. And with that, I think I went a little bit longer there than I anticipated, but I think we still got plenty of time for Tony and Mark, and I'll turn it over to Tony to begin discussing fall protection.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, and we could probably spend an hour or more on each one of these topics. So, it is a little bit difficult for us to kind of zoom through this information, but we're trying to be as efficient as possible when we're dealing with these issues. So, we encourage questions and some follow-up, but obviously these are not deep dive issues on these things. So with that, let me get into fall protection, 1926 subpart M. So fall protection has always been a priority for OSHA during construction compliance investigations. OSHA has a fall protection national emphasis program, the data behind it, and you can see here on the screen as far as the citations and the penalties go, really goes to show the significance and effort that OSHA is going into when it comes to compliance on fall protection. The 2023 BLS data shows that fall protection accounted for 40% of all of the construction related fatalities for that time period. So it's a very serious issue. It is something that OSHA takes very seriously, and is something that obviously you're going to see high numbers when it comes to investigations, and high numbers of citations, and very, very high penalties there. So between 2023 and 2024, OSHA issued well over 9,000 citations out of subpart M, with penalties totaling over $53 million. And the reason we're seeing these high penalties is that fall protection citations are almost always going to be issued as serious. Most of the injuries relating to fall protection are often catastrophic, with most of them resulting in a very serious injury, and sometimes much worse. So within subpart M, there's a few other sections in there that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I'm not going to go over each one of these issues or each one of the rules in these standards, obviously, but what we're going to do is I'm going to pull out the top 4 from each one of these sections, and let you know, these are the ones that OSHA is looking for. So first we have, 1926 501, which is the duty to have fall protection. This accounts for the lion's shares of citations and penalties. We had, 6,500 investigations between October 23 and 2024. That resulted in, over 6,600 citations out of this specific section of the standards, totaling over $46 million in total penalties. That's a lot of money. Granted, there's going to be some willful violations, probably some repeat violations that are included in there. But that being said, even with willful violations, that is a significant amount of penalties that you're going to see there. The next most frequent one, frequently cited set of rules, is 1926 503, which is the fall protection training section. You can see there that we had OSHA had over 2,100 investigations between 2023 and 2024, and issued a little over 2,000 citations, totaling over $4.8 million in total penalties. And then kind of following up behind that, you have 1926 502, which is the fall protection systems criteria and practices. Here we only had a handful of investigations as compared to the other ones, 414 inspections between October 2023 and 2024, with a total of 574 citations and $1.68 million in total penalties. So again, there's a lot of action here when it comes to fall protection, and it's something that you definitely need to be aware of. Because, like we were talking about earlier, these are ripe for repeat. And they're almost always going to be classified as serious. The next section that we have is 1926 501, the duty to have fall protection. These are the following 4 rules are really the ones that have been most cited in the last couple of years. Unprotected in 1926 501 B1, unprotected sides and edges. This rule was cited 917 times in 2023 and 705 times in 2022. Next, we have 501B10, roofing work on low-sloped roofs. This was cited over 900 times in the past 2 years. 1926 501B11, work on steep roofs. This was cited almost 600 times. And then we have 1926 501B13. So they're batting cleanup here. And this is the residential construction fall protection issue. So this rule was cited 5,069 times in 2023 and 4,167 times in 2022. That's over 9,000 times in that 2-year period. We don't have the 2024 to 2025 data, but there's no reason for us to believe that these numbers are going to go down. So again, fall protection is a serious issue. And, when it gets into residential, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this here shortly. Residential areas where we're seeing the most is where OSHA is seeing the most significant lapse in compliance. So 1926-501, these two rules, 501B1 and 501B10, it's pretty simple. Whenever you're working at heights, anything over 6 foot, you need to have some form of fall protection. It can be in the form of guardrails, safety nets, warning lines, or personal fall arrest systems. Whatever it is that you put into place, you need to make sure that your employees are protected when they're at that 6 feet, when they're at that 6 foot threshold. And again, these are very, very easy issues for OSHA to spot from a distance, similar to what Nick was seeing, what Nick had indicated during his trenching and excavation. If OSHA's driving down the street and they see the top of a couple of hard hats in a trench, they're going to stop and look at that. Same thing goes for fall protection issues. It's actually even easier, because they can see it from further away. They're going to drive down the street and they're going to see, couple of hard hats and safety vests up on the side of a building. When I was with Michigan OSHA, we were issued binoculars. We could easily look out and check and see, whether or not someone's tied off or whether or not they were wearing fall protection. Here now you have compliance officers with, Apple phones and, that they can easily zoom in and document that the fact that an employee may not be wearing fall protection or isn't properly tied off. And, when we saw those issues or if we saw anything like that, we were pretty much instructed to stop and initiate an investigation, or simply just called in the office if there was any type of potential fall protection issue while we, identified out in the field. So again, when you're dealing with fall protection, I get it. I had to wear fall protection when I was out doing my compliance investigations, and that was just me preparing and walking a job site. It's a lot different for you guys that are actually out there doing the work. I get that fall protection can be a pain. It's like any other personal protective equipment. It's going to be a hassle, especially to kind of put it on. It's going to take a few moments. And it's not always readily available. There's going to be those times when you're on the roof or one of your crew is on the roof and they need to run out to grab something, in an area that isn't properly guarded. Versus going down to the gang box to grab their fall protection. And, that's the time when, OSHA's going to be out there, they're going to see that, or, something worse could possibly happen. But, when you're working at heights, make sure your employees are protected. Make sure that they have the gear that they need to wear and, or proper other safeguards in place. Because again, it's easy, for someone to do that. And thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. The 2024 data is floating around out there, but sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to kind of cycle through that. But yes,
and
we
I'll
are
just,
aware of it.
I'll just add,
Go ahead, Mark.
I think the data that may be referred to is not the type of data that we're talking about, where it's a breakdown of each individual violation based on the standard. There's certain data that is available, from my understanding, in the 2024, but not the breakdown that we usually get typically, to be able to really break out which standard was cited the most and which wasn't, and how much money was cited under that standard.
Yeah, so we have some really good granular detail and some granular information on that. But regardless, though, Greg, I appreciate the input on that. To kind of keep things moving here, we get into 1926-501B11, which is steep roofs. Again, getting into it's how you need to have fall protection, some form of fall protection, whether it's tow boards, safety net systems, or personal fall arrest systems. And then we get into the residential construction. Our friends in that area that was cited over 9,000 times in the past couple of years. So, like I mentioned, residential construction has always had issues with OSHA compliance. Residential contractors were always notorious for failing to comply with fall protection requirements. In my time, it was hard to catch these guys out in the field. they'd be there one day, and gone in the next, and it's always typically hard to find someone who was in charge, who spoke English, or even who the name of the contractor was. So, there's a lot of challenges when it's coming when we're dealing with with residential contractors. But, with regards to, compliance, it's not a lot different than commercial construction. We all need to, and do those investigations. But regardless, though, there's not a lot of room for error when it comes to wearing the fall protection. So, whether or not you're doing commercial or residential, the same rules apply. So just make sure that you're out there, wearing the appropriate equipment and complying with the rules. The next set of citations we had, or the next set of standards we had, is for the fall protection systems criteria and practices. This is under 1926-502. Again, we have a series of specific rules that these are more the frequent flyers for this area of the standard. So D15, fall protection anchor points. And then we have D16 III, which is fall protection and stopping a fall. This is one that's, it was only issued 112 times in the past couple of years, but, I did come across this when I was working out in the field, and this is essentially not allowing an employee to fall more than 6 feet or contact a lower level. And, we typically would see this when I was doing my investigation, talking to the employee, figuring out, okay, how far is it from level A to level B? Sometimes it would be a 10-foot, 12-foot fall. If this person had a 6 or 4 foot fall protection lanyard on themselves, if they fall, the lanyard's going to kick in after a free fall of maybe 6 feet. But by that time, if it's only a 10-foot drop or a 6 or a 12-foot drop, they still have to fall, their feet and their ankles are likely going to hit that floor below them. So, you need to make sure that the fall protection is adequate enough to protect them from an actual fall. So, falling from heights off of a roof, that fall protection may be adequate, but fall protection from maybe a smaller area or a shorter fall, just simply having fall protection may not necessarily protect them from that. 502 D17 was the attachment of the fall protection to the worker to make sure that it's properly affixed to the employee. And then D21, the inspection of the fall protection prior to each use. Again, this is something that, is typically identified by the compliance officer during the interaction and interviews of the employee. And again, not something that's issued frequently, but it is some low-hanging fruit that you can kind of be aware of. So of those 4 rules, like I mentioned, those were the most frequently cited. OSHA is looking to make sure that employees are tied off to designated tie-off locations. If OSHA sees employees tied off to a guardrail system, they're likely going to start asking questions and dig into the capacity ratings for each of these tie-off points. And same with D17, the attachment points and how a worker is wearing their fall protection, again, is something that is typically identified by a compliance officer when interviewing workers and during their walk around. If they see that fall protection is just thrown on and not properly adjusted, they are going to stop and ask questions. And again, this citation or these issues, these compliance issues are going to lead to another compliance issue, which is likely going to get into training, which is my next topic. So again, here are the top 4 training requirements, and I'm going to kind of speed through these so I can give Mark, my colleague, some time to talk. We have 1926 503A1, 503B1, 503A2, and 503C3. Again, not nearly as frequently cited as the duty to have fall protection, but again, it is up there, especially 503A1, which is the fall protection training program. So, when we're getting into fall protection training, we have the training program itself and the competent person, and then we'll get to the next slide too that's going to talk specifically about the written certification. Again, all of these are very, very low-hanging fruit for OSHA. During any fall protection investigation, OSHA is going to ask for your fall protection training program and information on who provided the training. Specifically, was that person who provided the training a competent person, and did the training address, all the specific elements that are outlined in the fall protection standard. The nature of fall protection hazards in the worst place. The correct procedures for erecting and maintaining and inspecting fall protection that needs to be used, limitations, and so on and so forth. So again, very simple things that OSHA can identify, but things that are essential part of a comprehensive training program. Same thing gets into the written certification. Like I said, during an inspection, OSHA is going to ask for your training program and training certifications. For whatever reason, it always have these situations where there always seems to be 1 or 2 guys, or sometimes 12 to 16 workers that just seem to be missing their certifications. And it just seems to be those specific individuals that OSHA is interviewing or requesting information on. So, sometimes that happens because they're new and they just simply were trained, or they missed their training session. Regardless, it's a very easy citation for OSHA to hit, and maintaining these accurate training records is vital. So with that, I will pass this over to my colleague, Mark.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you, Greg, for pointing out that you have some access to data that maybe we didn't have awareness of. We will look into it. And so thank you for sharing that. As we close today's webinar, I'm just going to focus on 2 standards that are both heavily cited and easily preventable: scaffolds and PPE. Let's start with scaffolds. It falls under subpart L of OSHA's construction standard, and it's ranked typically OSHA's top citation for years. These violations matter because scaffold hazards cause falls and cause deaths. I mean, there are structural failures. There's always serious injuries happening in this arena, and we have, unfortunately, a long list of fatalities to deal with. So OSHA is very fixed on it, as Tony mentioned. The fall NEP is important to the way OSHA conducts its investigations, and whether even to start one. This falls squarely under that NEP as well. So if you see, if they see someone having on a scaffold, they'll likely stop. They're required to stop and look to make sure things are, compliant. So we'll walk through the scaffold requirements and the most frequently cited provisions, and specifically, most importantly, we're going to talk about what to do to avoid them. Now, the subpart L is, governs pretty much everything. And there's a lot involved there, so we can't go into every detail, but I just want to give it a very general overview. The scaffold rules under the subpart govern the design, erection, use, and dismantling. There's basically 4 major areas to focus on. Their general requirements for scaffold construction, stability, and capacity. There's access and fall protection. This is a very important topic: guardrails, harnesses, safe access points to prevent falls. We have a lot of experiences that I'm going to try to weave in here that you need to be aware of to prevent violations in this category. Inspections and maintenance is very important. Routine inspections to ensure safe conditions. And of course, training. It all starts with training, the training requirements. And then we'll go into that a little in detail. But the goal here is straightforward: you prevent falls, collapses, and falling objects, and make sure your folks know what they need to be aware of, so that they're aware of those hazards and they can avoid them. So under the design and load requirements, the scaffolds must be supported. They must support their own weight. They've at least 4 times the maximum intended load. They must have proper bracing, footing, guardrails. For fall protection, any scaffold over 10 feet or higher requires either guardrails or a personal fall arrest system. It's different for each type of scaffold, so you got to be aware of whether your scaffold requires both, one of them, and which. And this is frequently cited, so it's something to be very particularly concerned about. The guardrails have very strict height requirements: 38 to 45 inches for the top rail, mid rail is halfway between. If the OSHA doesn't see this from the road, they're going to immediately go ahead and do an inspection and cite you. So these are things these are details. They're very, you may not even find them important, but to OSHA they are, and they will cite them. Just the point is that there are measurable, easy to check requirements that directly prevent life-threatening falls. So make sure you focus on the guardrails and making sure that the folks have, your employees have the proper fall arrest systems. Access points must be safe. We'll talk about a lot of things that typically happen, but a lot of times people use the wrong access points to enter the scaffold. They climb across scaffold frames, and that's clearly prohibited by the standard. Inspections do prevent a lot of the potential violations, and the standard requires you to have those inspections done regularly by a competent person. You should have them done according to the standard before each work shift, specifically looking for wear, damage, and hazards, structural issues. These are things that you want to make sure you record so that you have them ready to go if there's an OSHA inspection, to show that you were not aware of something that happened all of a sudden. Maybe a plank fell off and you didn't know about it, but look, you had an inspection 2 hours before and it illustrated that that wasn't a concern. So this is something to cover yourself. Training is really important. It's not doing the minimal. It's just making sure these people could really think about what potential issues could go about happening in the course of their work. Specifically want to make sure that they're aware of the recognized hazards, understand load capacities, and know what to do if there's an emergency. It's about being proactive, making sure they have the skills to be proactive and let the competent person know something's not right. The idea is to fix issues before things go bad. Unfortunately, I've worked on a lot of fatality inspections associated with scaffolds, with the intent to make sure something like that doesn't happen. Unless you're on it all the time, you're going to definitely run into something. Whether it's the fatality is another story. So I just wanted to give a broad overview of what subpart L looks like, and it's broken out in categories. So you could see here there, the specific, the meat is 451, but there are also specialized standards for aerial lifts and of course training. And we'll talk about the ones that are most cited. So let me just go to that because we're running out of time here. Most frequently cited scaffolding rules. This is the top 5. So it's like David Letterman top 5 for scaffolding. OSHA's top 5 include 451B1, which is the failure to fully plank or deck platforms. 451E1, unsafe access to platforms. 451G1, missing fall protection above 10 feet. And then 453, no fall protection on aerial lifts, happens quite a bit because you think you have guardrails and that's enough, but that's not. Under the standard. 454A, inadequate scaffold training. And in 2024, 451 alone was cited over 2,000 times. Each of these violations is, as I said earlier, entirely avoidable. You just need the right staff, a competent person, and to have that person and your staff regularly check. I just to give you also just kind of an overview of the data here. I know that there's some additional 2024 data that we need to look at, but there's been, this standard is cited quite a bit. You have, 1926, 451 cited 2,071 times in 2024 and 2,850 times in 2023, something OSHA is looking at all the time. Overall, subpart L was cited 4,203 times in 23, and that came out to about 14 million, over 14 million in penalties for subpart L. The penalty breakdown, is for all the citation. The top 5 is 11 million. So this is pretty much what you need. These specific violations are what you have to look for or look out for. So let's take a look at the first one, 451B1, cited 358 times, 1.6 million in penalties. You could read what the standard requires, just, be aware that there's a specific way to lay out planks and the like, and how to address gaps. I don't want to go into that as much as to give you a real solid understanding of the kind of practices that you need to eliminate these types of hazards from occurring, eliminate possibility of getting a citation. So certainly, if you have any questions, ask. But what I have listed here is pretty much what you need to do. But the key practice to eliminate this type of thing at your work site is you make sure, number one, is to use manufacturer specific planks or decking. Never allow employees to think it's okay to make makeshift materials. That happens, unfortunately, quite a bit. So that's, again, another reason you need to inspect constantly, because you never know an employee is going to think, oh, this is easier to do it this way, but it's not compliant. So you want to stop it right away. You need to train crews on how to properly put in planks on installation and how to deal with gaps and the specific limits under the standard. You have to inspect daily. Again, I can't say it enough. You got to inspect daily for cracks, warping, looseness, or an employee doing something that you didn't think that you didn't think was possible, like removing a plank to get access to another part of the scaffold. That's the thing that happens. That's what leads to citations. That's what leads to fatalities, unfortunately. Because it's human to do things, try to do something you think is right, and your employee does it, and then next thing you know, something bad happens. So you're gonna need to replace damaged planks immediately. You have to have resources on site to do that. Otherwise, you got to stop the work. You maintain full planking, except where justified exception applies. So in those situations, you need to look more closely. Have your competent person be very acutely aware of those situations where maybe the exception applies. So the next one, 451E1, again, 371 times, including 14 repeats, almost 1.5 in penalties. This is just the simple concept here is, if a scaffold platform is more than 2 feet above or below the point of access, you need to have, an access point. And I can't tell you how many times we have cases where, OSHA cited, and, when I was at the solicitor, when, just employees move the ladder and then they don't put it back. And then people are doing things they're not supposed to do. They're accessing the platform. It's only 2 feet. It's only 4 feet. They could use, something, that is not supposed to be used as a way to gain access, like a cross brace or something. So, if there's something to be clear about, don't allow your employees to use a cross brace to access a scaffold platform. But again, I'm kind of smiling when I say that, but unfortunately the reality is it happens all the time because people move the ladder, right? And so have multiple ladders on site to prevent that. Make sure people are aware that they can't do that. You got to consistently reaffirm it within your program, your safety program. But here are some things you could do, some additional things. One of the things that I think is critical in general is to, plan yourself. When you have a scaffold, there should be planning involved. You should have a scaffold plan and have a plan that addresses the contingencies, like people moving ladders, or, if you had to do work in another section and you needed to go around. Well, employees think they could get access on, to make it easier on the side that has the cross braces, but no ladder. You got to think that through ahead of time. And make sure you have enough ladders, you install them. If you could put a stair system in before, do it. If you could put a ladder that's more permanently fixed, do it. Make sure you keep access, points clear of materials and debris, because if it's in front of the ladder, like, oh, it's in the way. Make sure it's drilled into your folks to not do that. And if they see it, they clear it out to make sure people have access to the proper ladder or access point. Make sure you train on this. Make sure you train on what routes they could use and what routes they can't use. Every job site should, remind employees of these types of things. There may be unique hazards at this site that the other site doesn't have. So they need to be reminded, and they need to be given a very strict understanding of what they can't do. And of course, at Conn Maciel, we always tell you, you need to monitor. You need to monitor. You need to record that monitoring. So have your soups, have your foremen do spot checks to ensure no one climbs on the scaffold frames or cross braces persistently throughout the project. Failure to provide scaffold fall protection. Again, fall protection is a very important issue for OSHA. as Tony said, and again, it's covered under the scaffolding standard differently. Cited quite a bit. You can see the numbers, 812, almost 4 million. The bottom line is anything over 10 feet, you need to make sure people are protected from falls. There are different types of fall protection, obviously. You may be able to rely on a guardrail system, but it depends. There's, and the stand goes into this. I don't have the time, but there are different types of scaffolds. Sometimes you need not just guardrails, but you also need personal fall arrest systems, such as in a single point or 2-point suspension scaffold. You need both. So you need to read the standard. So if you have a weird, unique situation, particularly, and you're not sure, you should obviously start with the standard and the plan that you have before you do the work to address what you need to do to ensure there's no falls, to ensure they're protected. I have to say it, cross braces do not count as guardrails. So, it's a common costly mistake that employers, get into. So don't think that. Here's some additional key things to think about to address the standard. Determine the appropriate fall protection system before, again, plan the use, install guardrails or set up, PFASs before workers access the platform. So doing it before always helps the situation because employees know what they're supposed to do. Training them on how to use that correctly. Obviously, it's important, but unfortunately, it's forgotten, especially when they think you train them already, but there's a new type of fall arrest systems that's being used, and they don't know how to deal with it. Inspect guardrails before each shift, so it's a daily inspection before everyone starts work, and remove defective fall protection equipment from service immediately. Do not let anyone think they could use it. And having it on site does lead some people to think it's okay. The failure to protect, to provide fall protection in aerial lifts, another important, cited quite a bit. I just want to, I think we covered a lot of this. I don't want to, focus on every detail of the standard because I think, you get the idea of what you need to do. But one of the things to keep in mind is that you can't tie off, adjacent structures when you have an aerial lift. Lanyards must be connected to the lift itself. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's cited quite a bit. But people think that the guardrail is enough, but it's not. So you just need to make sure you train employees if they're going to be working on something like that. Just 454A, failure to provide fall protection training. It's not cited and with a high number of penalty, but it's not cited as frequently with a high number of penalty. But this is where you could really prevent accidents from happening. This is where you could really make sure you're not cited. I think bottom line is what I want to be clear about in this slide, just to kind of move things along, is that you need to make sure their trainers are the right type of trainers. They're the qualified type. And I could talk about what that is. The standard's very vague about that. So you could probably get away as long as it has, the qualified person is competent to some level on this type of thing. But just be aware that there are certain quality trainings, and there are also some that are not so quality, and you need to really find the right one. If you need help finding that quality trainer, let us know. Sometimes you need to be in the classroom instead of just computer-based training. Some jurisdictions, like for example New York City, require you to follow the Department of Buildings requirements, which are very strict, much more strict than what the federal OSHA standards are, despite New York being a federal OSHA state. So you need to follow that jurisdiction. And there are other jurisdictions, if you have any questions about that in terms of training, that are different than the federal training standards. So just be aware the jurisdiction may require different types of training, like the Department of Buildings in New York City, which requires you to have in-person training, not remote training, and it has to be approved by the Department of Boards. So keep that in mind, especially for companies that have a national practice. So you could fall into trouble there. But this is where you could really make sure employees are, verify their understanding of the work before, they work on scaffolds. But all folks need to be trained on scaffolds if they're working on scaffolds according to the federal standard. And if there's a hazard different in one site and another site, you didn't train on it, what's going to happen is you're going to get cited for failure to train, because you trained on maybe standards for a different type of work site, and this type of work site with the scaffolding configuration is different. You needed to have trained on that. So you may have to train them every work site to address that. And then just the last here is personal protective equipment. Again, something cited quite a bit, and that's why we wanted to talk about it. We don't have, obviously we're over time, so I just want to just make a few points here. And you can see the numbers. It's cited quite a bit, believe it or not. But the real point here is, and it's in the next slide, is what to do. What practices would avoid these types of citations. Conduct hazard assessments for each task and make sure that's documented. That's required under the standards, and that's something that gets cited. But it really is, these are the citations that result from you failing to do that, no doubt. So that, make sure you have that document. Make sure the assessment was done for the different types of tasks. You have the understanding of what type of PPE needs to be done or used. And you have to understand there's different hard hats come of many shapes and sizes. Make sure you follow the ANSI compliant type. And there, for example, some hard hats are only designed so that the top is all that it's focused on. And there are some hard hats that have protection on the sides as well. So OSHA sometimes looks at this. Sometimes they cite it if they don't see the proper PPE being used. They inspect the hard hat and it's just not compliant with the ANSI standard and the type of work site, such as the construction site. Make sure it's all fits properly, and compatible with other type of gear. A lot of times employees want to take stuff off. If it's not compatible, it's not comfortable. There are certain type of PPE that you need to consider when dealing with electrical, environments and hazards associated with electrical. Make sure you get that correct PPE and it's marked appropriately, because employees grab the hard hat, but they don't grab the one that's, addresses the electrical potential hazards. And you could get into, in a serious accident, but most importantly, OSHA will look for that and cite you accordingly. Make sure you consistently replace damaged, worn, or expired PPE. That means you have to inspect your PPE regularly. You should enforce these PPE rules. You should discipline if employees are not wearing their PPE. Citations, I've seen so many where they're literally, the foreman their back is turned to the employee took off the glasses and OSHA shows up and took a picture. That happens. It's real. They took off their glasses. And why did they take off their glasses? Because they were damaged. So another thing you should do is keep a supply of spare PPE on site for quick replacement, and make sure your foremen are consistently making sure things are not broken, or that this PPE is not broken. Assign a PPE coordinator to track compliance and inventory. Store the PPE in the right place so that it's clean and it's not damaged. And again, I can't stress it enough. Address and correct non-compliance immediately. All right. Well, I'm going to turn it now over to Nick to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Mark and Tony. Thanks for everything that we've covered today. And thank you to those of you who have stayed on with us a bit longer than we initially planned to continue our discussion today. So we appreciate you all staying on. If you have any specific questions that we didn't address or that come up, I welcome you guys to still enter into chat, and we can get back to, following up, or right here at the end, our closing slide will be all of our contact information, so you'll be able to reach out to us directly. Just a reminder, we've got more webinars on the way for the OSHA session this year. Starting off next year with next month with a workplace crisis management presentation. And then on our mine safety side, we have webinars coming up the next few months as well, along with one next week, which will be a reschedule of our mid-year review and significant discussion. If you are interested in the California practice and Rachel's presentation and specific facts from earlier today, they have their own dedicated webinar series for the California practice. Again, we will have a kind of a cross webinar series crisis management presentation in September, but also we are going to be holding a couple in-person briefings out in California in October, one in Southern California and one in Northern California that Rachel and her team will be leading. And if you are out west and have interest and the time to come join us, we would welcome you to come out and love to see some of you in person, but really do appreciate you joining us virtually for each one of these presentations. As always, we are happy to provide any specific services that you guys might be interested in from a training standpoint, whether that's an OSHA masterclass or a record-keeping masterclass. And additionally, you can follow up on all this information and you'll see a copy of this webinar recording posted there shortly on the OSHA Defense Report blog and the Cal OSHA Defense Report blog. Appreciate all of your time today. As I mentioned before, we're happy to take any questions, whether in the chat function still here in the next few minutes, or if you want to reach out to us, any of us directly. All of our direct contact information is up on the screen. But we really do appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us for this discussion on citations and enforcement in the construction industry.